The jury is now deliberating in the Karen Reed trial. They deliberated for a couple hours yesterday on Tuesday, and now today they are continuing the deliberations as this video is being made. So we will see if we have a verdict by the end of the day today. Who knows? But they deliberated for a couple hours yesterday. The judge sent a note asking them if they want to continue the deliberations into the evening, or do they want to call it a day and come back tomorrow, which is today, and to continue the deliberations on Wednesday. They decided to go home for the night and come back today to continue the deliberations. Now, what does that mean to me? What I imagine that means, and this is just a guess, speculation, pure speculation, but what I imagine that means is that since they did have a couple hours to talk about the case, there's no quick verdict here. Everybody's not on the same page, and I imagine that there's somewhat split in the voting, and therefore they decided, you know what, instead of rehashing all the evidence and trying to talk to each other and see if we can come to an agreement, let's just go home and we'll come back tomorrow, we'll rehash everything again, and then we'll see if we get any movement by any of the jurors. So that's what I imagine. I imagine there's some sort of split in the jury right now, whether to come back with a guilty or not guilty. So that's why I imagine they're coming back today. Now, let's jump into the closing arguments that happened yesterday. I think it's worthwhile analyzing, very interesting by both Alan Jackson and Adam Lally. And of course, I'll give you my opinions about certain things maybe they could have done differently, or, you know, any thoughts that I have on their actual performance during the closing arguments. Now, as defense attorney, sometimes you get to go first, and sometimes you get to go second. And different jurisdictions, different courts do it differently. In Massachusetts, in this specific court, the defense actually went first. The defense went first, then the prosecutor went, and that was it. Sometimes in other jurisdictions, you have the prosecutor go first, then the defense go second, and then the prosecutor gets a final rebuttal. Either way, the prosecutor always gets the last word. So if you are in the defense's shoes, if you're the attorney, you would probably want to go second. Why? Because then you get to hear the arguments that the prosecutor is making, and then you're able to rebut them in your closing arguments. In this specific situation, since the defense went first, it kind of puts you in a position where you have to anticipate what type of arguments the prosecutor is going to make and then dispel those arguments. Kind of what I talk about a lot during opening statements. When you go first, you've got to anticipate and dispel some of the arguments that the other side is going to be making during their opening statement. So very similar, that's what your train of thought has to be when you're closing on behalf of the defendant. You're the defense. You're closing first. You got to anticipate what the prosecutor is going to be arguing. And this is something that I think Alan Jackson overlooked, one, I think, very important argument that Adam Lally made. So before that, let's talk about what he did argue in closing arguments. Now, he started off very strong. He started off with the following phrase: look the other way. That is what the Commonwealth and the police want you to do in this case. They don't want you to concentrate on all the facts and the evidence that we brought out, and we showed you why there's so many problems with the investigation here, and there's so much skipping of videos, and we're going to get into all of that. But that is the theme, and that was his theme in this closing argument, that the Commonwealth and the police in this case, they just want you to look the other way. They don't want you to look at the entire picture here, because if you do, you're going to have some serious questions and certainly reasonable doubt. Another strong way that he started off is that you have been lied to. A very strong statement. A lot of times as an attorney, you don't want to say that straight out, that you've been lied to. You say, you've been mistaken, or you've been asked to overlook certain things, or the other side is being disingenuous by ignoring certain facts, or they're not talking about certain facts, but you don't always say straight out, you have been lied to. It's a very strong statement, but that is the posture that Alan Jackson has been taking in this case all along from the beginning, and therefore certainly you're going to hear that in closing arguments. Now, when I was thinking, and this is what I do because I'm a trial lawyer, so when I was thinking myself, well, how would I start off my closing argument if I was in Alan Jackson's shoes? This is what I always try to do on this channel, is put ourselves in the position of the defense attorney and sometimes in the position of the prosecutor and see what we would maybe do differently. So I was just thinking myself that if this was me, my first slide would be, and I like to do a lot of slides in my closing arguments and opening statements. I like to have a PowerPoint. I like to go through and visualize a lot of things. But what I would have, my first slide would be a text message. And it was a text message actually between Michael Proctor and his buddies. And one of his buddies, in the first day when they're talking about this case, one of his buddies says, "Something stinks." and I would have had that plastered as the first big slide. Something stinks. And this was something that Michael Proctor's friend realized right away from day one, that something stinks. And now by the time we're done with this trial, you all see not only is this stinks, but there is some serious corruption, serious problems with the way that this case was investigated. Something absolutely stinks in this case. And all that obviously is going to equal reasonable doubt. But again, I wasn't the attorney, so I wasn't able to do that. But I think that would have been a very powerful way to start. Again, Alan Jackson also started very powerfully. So he also said that he did reference some of the parts of the text messages, and he said that Michael Proctor from the beginning, and this is also from the text messages, he said he is going to make this cut and dry, and there's going to be serious charges on the girl. And that's how he phrased it. He didn't change anything because he's trying to show how they are not even, that Michael Proctor is not even referring to Karen Read by her name, the girl, So that was another thing that he pointed out. He said in this case, and he had some good lines while he was closing, he said in this case, you don't have to wonder if they would lie. You just have to wonder how many times they would lie. Because it's clear that they lied a number of times. You're going to be hearing, and this is what you heard in this trial, all these claims that calls never happened when we have records that they did. You heard a lot about butt dials, which is just ridiculous. This is all lying to you. You think there was a butt dial and butt answers? That was also part of Alan Jackson's closing arguments. They will turn 3 pieces of taillight into 5 pieces of taillight. We all remember that scene when you had Lieutenant Tully on the stand and Alan Jackson got him right there to say, hey, wait a second, there's more pieces in the bag. You're just showing 2. There's another piece in the bag. They're trying to lie to you. Again, there was a cover-up. There was certainly a cover-up. Deleting your call history, destroying your phones, destroying your SIM cards, not going to the crime scene, secret family meetings, keeping people together while you're interviewing them. And therefore, when the Commonwealth has nothing, and you see the cover-up that's going on here, they're deleting of everything. What they resort to was character attack. And they had tried to attack Karen Read. They got their outsider, who they're going to pin this on, and they started attacking her character. How? By showing the arguments that she had with John O'Keefe. And you know something about the arguments? This is all, of course, Alan Jackson's argument. And you know something about those arguments? Those arguments was because Karen Read was too kind. And John O'Keefe felt that she was spoiling his niece and nephew that he's taking care of. Those were what the type of arguments were. Not more personal attacks. That's what the arguments were about, her being too nice to his niece and nephew. And again, remember, everybody at the waterfall, everybody at C.F. McCarthy's testified that they were getting along just fine, and that's how they appeared that night. There was no issues. They were happy. They were affectionate to each other. Even some said, quote, lovey-dovey to each other. And something Alan Jackson said very strongly, if an argument, even if we know that there was an argument before this, but if an argument with a loved one is a motive for murder, well, folks, we're all in trouble. Because everybody understands that relationships, you have disagreements, you have arguments, sometimes they can get nasty, and most of the time you just make up afterwards and everything's fine. So they're pointing out, there was some argument between John O'Keefe and Karen Read. Yeah, that's true. But there's never any history of any sort of abuse, physical abuse, certainly, between the two of them. There were some verbal arguments, but nothing more. Now, remember when they all got together? This is, again, Alan Jackson. Remember they all got together and they decided what the story is going to be, that no one ever came into 34 Fairview? Well, there was a person who made a little slip on that, Brian Higgins. Because Brian Higgins said that a man did come into the house. That's what he remembers. And the man was a tall man, similar to to John O'Keefe. But he said that must have been a slip of the tongue. He wasn't supposed to say that. So when you have all of these biased individuals who are giving you this testimony, what should we look to? What should we look to as a jury, as a juror, to be able to come to a conclusion here, to be able to come to a verdict? What should we look to? You know what you should look to? You should look to unbiased data. That's what you should look to. Well, what would be unbiased data? Well, how about the Apple Health data, which shows that John O'Keefe took 80 steps and he descended stairs. That's what the data on the on his phone showed. Well, what do they want you to look at? They want you to look at the Waze. They want you to look at the Waze app, which showed that during that time when the phone was recording steps, according to Waze, they were still in the car traveling on the way there. Well, they don't want you to think about the fact that the Waze was using a different clock. Remember, there's three different internal clocks that the apps can use, and the Waze was using a different internal clock, but according to the other clocks, John O'Keefe was already at 34 Fairview. Now, here's a very strong point that Alan Jackson made in his closing arguments. Let's think about the data for a second, right? So you got the data showing steps by John O'Keefe's phone. Well, at 12:32 in the morning, John O'Keefe's phone was recording steps. And that's very important. 12:32 in the morning. Why is that so important? Because it is clear that Karen Reed left 34 Fairview no later than 12:30. You know how we know that? Very simple. This is all unbiased data. That is the fact that we know that Karen Reed's cell phone connected to John O'Keefe's Wi-Fi at his home at 12:36 a.m. That was the testimony. And that was clear. That's in the records. Her phone connected to John O'Keefe's Wi-Fi at 12:36. Now, if that's the case, we know on a good day, traveling from 34 Fairview to John O'Keefe's home takes 6 minutes. Now, remember, there was a blizzard outside, or the beginning of a blizzard. But even on a good day, it takes at least 6 minutes, which means if her phone connected to John O'Keefe's house at 12:36, she must have already left no later than 12:30. And John O'Keefe's phone is recording steps at 12:32. So even if you want to buy all this Waze, using the Waze clock, everything makes sense, it doesn't make sense. Because how is his phone recording steps at 12:32? And by the way, Lally did not mention this at all. He didn't make any argument about this data point. Now, he also continued. He said that Ryan Nagel, as again Alan Jackson, Ryan Nagel and Heather Maxim also said that they passed Karen Reed's SUV when she was alone in the car. That's what his testimony was. He looked into the car. Her dome light was on. Remember, they both arrived around the same time, around 12:20ish, 12:30ish, around that time. Must be a little closer to 12:20. And Ryan Nagel was supposed to pick up Julie Nagel, and then they ended up not picking her up. So they left. But as he passed by Karen Reed's SUV, the Lexus, he testified he looked inside. He saw that there was only the dome light was on, and only Karen Reed was in the car. John O'Keefe was not there anymore. Also, Ryan Nagel said that he observed the taillight, and at that point, the taillight was completely intact, not broken at all. Where could John O'Keefe have been? He was not in the car. The dome light was on, and all Ryan Nagel saw was Karen Reed. Well, Alan Jackson says there's only one place he could have been, and that's at 34 Fairview. He was in the house. That's why he wasn't seen by Ryan Nagel. Here's another problem that Alan Jackson pointed out. Jennifer McCabe testified that she was looking at that SUV outside of the house consistently from 12:29 a.m. through 12:50. Now, he said 12:50. I think it was really 12:45, but this was Alan Jackson, what he said. 12:29 to 12:50, Jennifer McCabe testified that she was consistently looking outside that window at the SUV, at Karen Reed's SUV. Saw it move up, right? It was back and then moved up. But we know that she was gone by 12:30. So how could it have been that Jennifer McCabe was looking throughout all those minutes between 12:29 and 12:50? Now, if it was that first time, that was the only time she saw, okay. But Alan Jackson represented that her testimony, what he remembers her testimony to be, that she continuously looked outside the window and kept seeing the vehicle there up until 12:45, around that time. So his argument is it's impossible. She had to have been lying on the stand. Remember all those phone calls that Jennifer McCabe made to John O'Keefe's phone that were not answered. She claims she doesn't remember any of them, and she claims that it was butt dials. And remember, this is all, or pocket dials. This is the case of butt dials and pocket dials. We've been hearing a lot about that, and quite frankly, butt answers, as we're going to hear about a little bit soon. So, yeah, all those phone calls to John O'Keefe's phone was just butt dials. Or, says Alan Jackson, maybe it was because they were looking for his phone after they killed him. and they're trying to locate his phone. They didn't know where it was. That's what they're calling it. Now, let's talk about the Brian Higgins-Karen Reed relationship. You're right. This is what Alan Jackson said. You're right. Karen Reed had a flirtatious few days of texting with Brian Higgins, but then she got over it. Maybe she was interested at some point, but then she wasn't anymore. She was done. She had a bad moment. She had a low moment. You're right. It wasn't the right decision, but she got over it. But you know who didn't get over it? Brian Higgins. He still wanted the relationship. And that's why he's the one that continuously texts her. He's the one that's texting her. She completely ghosted him after a few days before the murder. She was done with him. She was done with that whole situation. And Brian Higgins was not. This is what Alan Jackson's argument is. And that's why Brian Higgins texted Karen Reed after she left the waterfall. Well, like, hey, what about me? I want this. Now, what's also interesting is that Brian Higgins wasn't such good friends with John O'Keefe. They weren't like buddies. And nevertheless, Brian Higgins was trying to lure John O'Keefe to 34 Fairview. Why is that? Why do you think that is? And again, this is Alan Jackson's arguments. Remember the sparring and the fighting, the play fighting that Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were caught doing on the surveillance. Remember Brian Albert's testimony where he said that Chloe was not upstairs. That actually Brian Albert said that she was watching Chloe downstairs because she's not good with strangers. So Chloe wasn't locked up upstairs somewhere. She was actually downstairs. And she's not good with strangers. And that's why Brian Albert had to watch her. Watch Chloe. And everybody agrees that Brian Higgins at some point and Brian Albert left the kitchen. They excused themselves. They went somewhere. Now, after that night, or after Brian Higgins left, where did Brian Higgins go? He goes directly to the Canton Police Department. He goes to the Canton Police Department, and his story evolves. At one point, he said that he went back to the Canton Police Department at 1:30 in the morning to perform some administrative duties. And now during trial, he said that he went there because he had to move some cars so that from the parking lot so that it wouldn't get in the way of the plows. Well, which one is it? And ask yourself, was that the real reason that Brian Higgins was going back to the Canton Police Department? After such a long day, he was together with Brian Albert in New York with a funeral for a fallen police officer, and then all that traveling back and forth and then having a long night. He wouldn't just go home. He decided to go to the Canton Police Department and really to move cars or administrative duties, whatever you want to buy. Nah, there's probably something more going on there, right? Chloe. This is one of the big mysteries of this case. As what Alan Jackson points out. Where in the world was Chloe? Chloe was gone that morning. Nobody remembers anything about Chloe that morning. When Jennifer McCabe, and he didn't say this, but he should have. When Jennifer McCabe burst into their room, there's no reaction from Chloe. She doesn't remember anything with Chloe. So where was Chloe? And isn't it interesting that a few months later, they decided to rehome Chloe, a dog that they've had for 7 years. People get very attached to their pets. And this is not just a pet they had for a few months or a year or two. This is a 7-year, it's part of the family. And then just coincidentally, a few months after this whole incident, they decide to rehome Chloe. Let's think about Dr. Russell. Dr. Russell, Marie Russell, who has seen thousands of animal attacks. She's an expert in animal attacks. She's written some papers and researched it. And her expert testimony was that the injuries on John O'Keefe's arm are consistent with an animal attack. Most likely a large dog. Then he went on to the conversations or the phone calls in the call logs between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins at 2:22 in the morning, where Brian Albert calls Brian Higgins, hangs up. Brian Higgins calls back Brian Albert, and there's a 20-second conversation or a 20-second of silence. Whatever, there's 20 seconds of their phones connecting with each other. And they both claim that it was butt dials and butt answers. And that is just not believable at all. That's not credible in the slightest. Then he also testified, Brian Higgins, that you can't even have a conversation in 22 seconds. It's just not possible. And this is where Alan Jackson said, let's see if that's possible. And he played out hello. And he played out a conversation that could have happened between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins. And he's like, how long did that take? Took about 15 seconds? For sure you could have had a conversation in 22 seconds. That's completely ridiculous to say you can't have a conversation in 22 seconds. Use your common sense, right? Then we have Jennifer McCabe's Google search, which he talked about, that the phone call was at 2:20. I'm sorry, not the phone call. The Google search that Jennifer McCabe did was at 2:27 in the morning. How long to die in cold? Remember that from our expert, Richard Green. And even those experts that the Commonwealth called, his response to that was they didn't rule it out. They didn't rule out that he couldn't have done the search, that Jennifer McCabe couldn't have done the search at 2:27. They just said that it could also have been done at 6:23. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that's what they testified to, but that was Alan Jackson's representation of what they testified to. I think they tried to get that admission out of them, but from my memory, I don't think that that's what they said. But that's what Alan Jackson represented. Also, the fact, and this was the strong point, is that Richard Green was the only expert who actually used Jennifer McCabe's actual phone and actual iOS. And the other experts didn't use the exact same iOS and exact same phone model. Let's think about Brian Loughran, the plow driver. He said that he went down that street, 34 Fairview, multiple times, and he didn't see anybody there. And he said that he can see everything. It was like a spotlight. You can see the entire front lawn. And he didn't see any body in that lawn. He also testified that he saw at 3:30 in the morning the Ford Edge. Remember that Ford Edge, which was moved right directly to block, it seems, to block where John O'Keefe's body was lying. Remember who owns that Ford Edge? Brian Albert. And remember that exit that you can get from the basement that can take you to the backyard, which there's a fence which you can go through that fence and go to the front yard. So it's very easy to take a body out of the basement through that bulkhead exit through the backyard and drop the body in the front yard. Now we spoke about also the 1237 angry voicemails that Karen Reed left for John O'Keefe. And he kind of played this as a normal kind of reaction by someone who is waiting for their significant other, long-term boyfriend, and they're supposed to get back to you. They're not answering the phone calls. They're not texting. And yeah, she gets upset. And she starts leaving these nasty voicemails for him. But that could be normal. That's just a normal relationship where you just get upset that the person's not answering. It's 12:30 in the morning. Come on. Don't leave me out here in the cold. So that was the reason for those angry voicemails. She also called 53 times before finding him that morning. Does that make sense for someone who just committed murder and knows what they did to call the person 53 times? It's a little ridiculous. Makes much more sense that she actually didn't know what happened to him. And she's trying to figure out what happened. That's why she's calling him 53 times. Now, here's also another strong point that he made, and it's always important to show how the other side is not being transparent and they're not being truthful with you. They're not being honest. That's a very important part in closing arguments whenever you're trying a case. You want to show that the other side is not being forthcoming with you. So here, Alan Jackson pointed this out. He said, the Commonwealth is not supposed to be looking for convictions. Prosecutors are not to be here to try to win their cases. That's not their job. Their job is to present you with the truth. And the truth is supposed to be what the jury hears, and then the jury should come to the conclusion. If it's conviction, it's a conviction. If not, not. The Commonwealth is not supposed to be looking for convictions. Now, if that's true, why is it that we, the defense, had to show you that when Karen Reed was backing out her car at 5 o'clock in the morning when she was leaving John O'Keefe's house to look for John O'Keefe, they claimed that her car never even came into contact with John O'Keefe's car. And we had to blow it up for you and show you this video showing that, no, they actually did come into contact. We showed you that tire moving. John O'Keefe's car, right, his tire on his car moving when Karen Reed's SUV banged into a little bit. Remember, the Dighton police officer, Barreros, he testified that taillight from Karen Reed's SUV was cracked, but not completely damaged. A piece was missing. That was his testimony. He's not part of the Canton Police Department. He doesn't have to cover for all these guys. So he actually is credible. And what does he testify? Yeah, it was a little cracked. A little crack. Not the crack that we see. And then he showed these two pictures next to each other of her taillight. One of them, which the tail is completely blown off, looks like. And then another part of it, when it was really reconstructed, there's only a little bit of a tiny crack. He's like, which one do you think he was talking about? Obviously, he was talking about the other one. And what do you think? The police, the Canton Police Department, or maybe Michael Proctor, they were the ones who actually cracked that a lot more and planted the evidence. Now, the Canton Police Department was recused. And then Michael Proctor got involved. And here, Alan Jackson did something which is, I think, very sharp. And he said, kind of like in the middle of his closing arguments, he said, well, the Canton Police Department was recused. And then Michael Proctor got the case. And the McCabe's and the Alberts thought that they just hit the lottery. They just lucked out because they have this good friend of theirs, Michael Proctor, who's going to be taking over this investigation. And they even thought, this is what he said, they even thought we have to get him a gift. No, they didn't just think it. They said it. Remember those text messages? So that was a great tactic by Alan Jackson there. Let's also remember during the when Michael Proctor was on the stand, and Alan Jackson pointed out that on the affidavits he wrote in the affidavits that the car, Karen Reed's SUV, was towed at 5:30 p.m. Okay, remember he said that, and he was saying that that's not really true, is it? It was actually towed at 4:17 p.m. Remember when Michael Proctor's on the stand, this is what he established. And a lot of times, you're maybe watching these trials and you're wondering, I wonder what they're getting at here. Like, why is he asking questions about what exact time? Well, just to show that he's a liar? Why would he lie about that time? Well, now in closing arguments, he finishes the story, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. You bring out some of your points with the witnesses, and then in closing arguments, you put it all together. So he'd had that back and forth with Proctor. And Proctor said, yeah, it was a typo. It was just a typo, and I wrote 5:30, but really, you're right. It was 4:17, and it was just a typo. So Alan Jackson says to the jury, that's not true at all. Let me explain to you why he wanted to write 5:30 p.m. instead of 4:17 p.m. The reason that he did that is because the first time that any taillight was found at 34 Fairview was at 5:45 p.m. Now, if that car, the Karen Reed's SUV, is being towed at 5:30, what are the chances? It's completely impossible for somebody to get a hold of that taillight when it's in the Canton Police Department in the Sallyport and start planting evidence. But if that car was actually towed at 4:17 p.m., well, that would give plenty of time to Michael Proctor or anybody else, one of his cohorts, to go crack that taillight more and start planting those pieces at 34 Fairview. And then magically at 5:45 p.m., oh, look at this. We found some taillight pieces there. And was a very strong argument that Alan Jackson made. Remember Michael Trotter. Michael Trotter was Brian Loughran's supervisor. And he told Michael Proctor that Fairview was plowed that night. And it was plowed by Brian Loughran. Well, did Michael Proctor bother to even interview Brian Loughran? Nope. Not till much, much later. Why is that? Well, here, because you're going to actually have a real witness who's going to know whether there was a body there or not. And that's not what Michael Proctor wants to have. He wants to help with the conspiracy. He didn't even name him in any report. Michael Proctor did not even name Brian Loughran in any of the reports. Again, that was a point that Alan Jackson made out. Then he spoke about the glass. The glass on the bumper. Remember that glass on the bumper we all saw? Well, that glass on the bumper was testified to, had nothing to do, was not connected to the cocktail glass. Now, there was a different piece on the bumper, which did match some of the glass at the scene. But there's only one person who had access to that glass. And that was Michael Proctor. And then the magic hair. Spoke about the magic hair. How did that hair get stuck on the taillight? Yeah, you're right. The hair was the DNA of John O'Keefe. Wonderful. But how did that hair get there? Are we supposed to believe that hair traveled 70 miles per hour? I'm sorry, not 70 miles per hour. 70 miles being towed in the middle of a blizzard. And that hair magically sticks onto that car? And now they're able to magically, oh, wow, look at this hair. And then test it for DNA. Oh, it's John O'Keefe's. Wow, look at that. It must have been that Karen Reed backed into him. Obviously, it was planted there. What about the DNA on the outside of the taillight? Of course the DNA on the outside of a taillight is going to have John O'Keefe's DNA. She's his girlfriend. Of course, he's around that car all the time. So, of course, there's going to be some DNA on the outside of his taillight. How about all the videos? Every single video in this case seemed to have been manipulated. Remember the Sallyport video? Well, there was two videos. There was a grainy one, and then there was the clear one. Well, let's talk about the grainy one first. The grainy one has significant parts missing. Exactly the part of the video which we all want to see is magically missing. Isn't that really interesting? And what about the other video? Do you know when we got the other video? We got the other video in the middle of trial. They were sitting on this video, not allowing us to, not handing it over to us. This is the type of shenanigans that's going on in this case. That was Alan Jackson's point here. And then even when we got that video, they were talking about this video when it was inverted as if it wasn't inverted. So you're looking at the video, you think that when they're talking about the right rear, which you see in the video, that's actually incorrect. That wasn't even the true part. It's not the right rear. The whole thing was inverted. So what you think is the right side of the vehicle is really the left side. And only we had to bring that out. We had to bring that out. Remember how many times initially, when they looked at this, how many different police officers from the Kansas Police Department, when they initially responded to the scene, no one could find any pieces of taillight. Some pieces of taillight that are as big as a salad bowl. They weren't able to find that, and they were searching. How does that make any sense? And then later, when Crime Scene Services takes over, O'Hara, he was able to finally locate 6 or 7 of the 47 pieces that were later located there, some as big as a salad bowl. Crime Scene Services weren't able to locate them? That doesn't make any sense. He also said he spoke about that Lieutenant Tully lying about the plastics, the plastics in the evidence bags, some of the plastic pieces of the taillight. Then he moved on to Dr. Scortibello. Dr. Scortibello could not conclude that John O'Keefe was hit by a car. And she could not even conclude that it was a homicide. She left that undetermined. And she also testified, and this is the medical examiner in this case, she also testified that some of his injuries are consistent with the physical altercation, and that his injuries are not classical injuries that you would find in an auto pedestrian crash. Let's remember Dr. Sheraton. Dr. Sheraton was the defense's expert. He performed something like 13,000 autopsies in his career. And he's seen hundreds and hundreds of cases of pedestrian accidents and animal attack accidents. And he testified that the injuries on John O'Keefe's arm are inconsistent with a motor vehicle accident. And they are consistent with a physical altercation and dog bites. Remember Dan Wolf and Dr. Rechler, who, remember, are 100% independent in this case. We didn't hire them. We didn't hire these experts. They were completely independent. And they are biomechanical engineers. They are real experts. They're not like some Trooper Paul here. These guys are the real deal. And you know something else? They were equally available to the Commonwealth as well as to the defense. Now, if the Commonwealth is supposed to be just presenting you with the facts in this case and the truth, why wouldn't the Commonwealth call these witnesses? Why did we have to call these witnesses? Why should the defense have to call these witnesses? The only logical explanation is that the Commonwealth is looking for a conviction. They don't care about the truth. If they cared about the truth, they would have called these biomechanical engineers themselves. They could have. They were available, equally available to both of them. They weren't our experts. We didn't hire them. And what did they say? Well, we had Dan Wolf, who said that his analysis was whether the damage to the vehicle is consistent with it being hit into John O'Keefe, and he said it was absolutely inconsistent. And then we had Dr. Rechler, who said that the injuries to John O'Keefe are also inconsistent with this whole story of the Commonwealth. And he spoke about Trooper Paul for about 30 seconds, and he said he's being kind. Alan Jackson's being kind by saying that his analysis lacks credibility. Remember the quote that he quoted from Dr. Rentschler, that you can't deny the science and the physics. You just can't deny them. And in this case, the science and the physics say that John O'Keefe was not hit by that car. Can't deny the science and physics. You also can't explain, nobody can explain, the lack of injuries from his neck down. No breaks, no bruises, no fractures on his arm. This isn't a thin blue line. This is a tall blue wall. Another great line by Alan Jackson. And then he did something which really, really toes the line. You got to be very careful with this type of argument, because you may not always get away with this. And that is the fact about saying that the jury's job now is to ensure that this conduct is not going to continue. Okay? That is a very, very thin line itself, because you have to argue to the jury that the jury has to make a decision on the facts based on this case, not that you have to send a message to the police department or send a message to other people that this type of behavior can't go on. So you got to be careful with saying those type of arguments. And that's something that Alan Jackson actually did. He said that part of your job is to make sure that this conduct doesn't continue. And then he spoke about Michael Proctor, and this is how he ended, which is, again, very strong. Started off with Michael Proctor, and he ended off with Michael Proctor. And he said, the Commonwealth cannot distance themselves from the stench of Michael Proctor in this case. Looking late at night for naked pictures of the suspect that they're going to charge with these serious charges on the girl. Talking about her medical conditions. And then he said, I don't even have it in me to repeat those names he called her. He reduced her to an object, dehumanized her, and wished suicide on her. He wishes that she would just kill herself. This is your lead investigator. And he said that you have to find, in order to convict her, that the evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt. And to a moral certainty which is the highest degree possible. And in this case, you just can't do that. And that's essentially how Alan Jackson finished. Okay, so that was Alan Jackson's closing argument. And then we moved on to Adam Lally. And Adam Lally started off very, very similar to how I would have started off. I just would have done it a little bit, I feel, stronger. So how did Adam Lally start it off? He started off saying, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And he said it 4 times. I thought he only said it 3 times. But he said, that's what she said, and 4 different people heard that. Now, I would have started up a little bit stronger, I think. And I think if it was me, if I was a prosecutor, I would have started off the following. I would have said, not in every case do we have a confession by the defendant. Not in every case do we have an admission by the defendant. In this case, we actually have a confession. Karen Reed confessed to the crime. I'm not even sure why we're here. This case is over as soon as she admitted and confessed that she hit him. Then that should be the end of your deliberations. She admitted to the crime. But he didn't use exactly that way, but that's how I would have done it. All right, so he said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, and we heard that from 4 different people. So even if you want to buy this whole conspiracy, and he's going to talk about the conspiracy, but even if you want to buy this whole conspiracy that Jennifer McCabe you can't trust, well, what about all the other people there? The other 4 people, the paramedics. The paramedics have such deep connections and ties to the Albert and McCabe family that they're going to go lie about this now? There's 4 different independent people who heard her say that. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a maybe I hit him. It wasn't a did I hit him. It wasn't a could I have hit him. They heard her say I hit him. And that is the same as a confession in this case. And of course, Alan Lally says that the defense in this case is trying to distract you. They're trying to play 3-card Monte with you. They're trying to distract you from the facts and the evidence in this case. And this is how both sides, they always play it like this way, right? Now, something that he stressed, that Adam Lally stressed, which Alan Jackson didn't stress, and something, by the way, I always stress. I always try to stress this in closing arguments, and I know I'm not trying to be too hard on Alan Jackson, or, obviously he's an amazing attorney, but just a few different things that stuck out in my mind. Adam Lally said, then there's a specific jury instruction about this, that the jury has to use common sense and life experience. You're not supposed to check your common sense by the door. You have to use common sense and use your life experience to think about this case. So I think that if I was Alan Jackson, I would have said, ladies and gentlemen, there is a very simple jury instruction. And I usually put it up on the screen. You got to use your common sense in this case. So I'm going to ask you, use your common sense. Take a look at this picture. If again, I'm Alan Jackson. Take a look at the picture. Show the picture of John O'Keefe's arms. Show those injuries. And say, use your common sense. Just forget about experts. Forget about biomechanical engineers. Forget about everything you've heard in this trial. Use your common sense. Where do those injuries come from? Did they come from a car accident, or did they come from some sort of scratching or clawing or biting? Just use your common sense. But again, Alan Jackson didn't argue that. I think he could have and should have, and I probably would have. But Adam Lally is saying, he's arguing this. You got to use your common sense and life experience about what happened in this case. She said that she hit him, right? All right. So now, then he gets into the text messages, and he has to address the text messages of Michael Proctor. He's got to do that, right? So he says the text messages from Proctor are distasteful, they're indefensible, but it doesn't change the integrity of the investigation. And this was Michael Proctor's testimony also. He's like, yeah, I did something terrible, and I should have never said those text messages, and I'm a terrible person. Maybe I was, but I'm just one piece of the puzzle, and the investigation still was done with integrity, which, okay, some arguments about that. But that's what Adam Lally is saying. Adam Lally is saying these text messages were terrible, and that's what he has to do. He has to own up to them. And he says, but still, let's not let your anger, let's call it, for Michael Proctor, ignore the rest of the integrity of the investigation and the fact that Karen Reed murdered John O'Keefe. Let's talk about the conspiracy, he says. Let's talk about this conspiracy. This conspiracy, there is no evidence of. It's just speculation. It's speculation. It's conjecture. That's what it is. There's no real hard evidence of this conspiracy. You can try to point at a few pieces of evidence and try to connect everything together if you're really fanciful, but there's no real evidence of a conspiracy. Then he goes through a timeline, and he shows a number of text messages between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed, January 28th, which they were very clearly in a disagreement. They were in a fight. And Karen Reed was trying. She called him a million times and was texting him all these things. Do you want to talk? Do you want to leave me? Do you want to just, are we done with this relationship? She was texting him all these type of things, and he wasn't interested. And he even said he's not interested in actually finishing the relationship. He wants to continue the relationship. He just doesn't want to fight. But he wasn't interested in engaging in these text messages. But what you do see clearly is that there is some serious disagreement or fights going on January 28th before they went out to the C.F. McCarthy's and the bars that night, Waterfall. Then he goes through the text messages. It goes through the drinks that she had. She had about 9 drinks. That's what he counted, according to the videos. Of course, some people will disagree with that, but according to Adam Lally, he's going to argue, and he's the prosecutor, that she had 9 drinks. Then he talks about the data of her going 24.2 miles per hour backwards in her car at around that time. Then the steering wheel, how it moves, it's all consistent with hitting a pedestrian. And of course, he plays some of the voicemails, some of those terrible voicemails that Karen Reed left for John O'Keefe, saying, I effing hate you, and you're a pervert, and all those things. And then even lying about going that she's back in Mansfield and the kids are home alone, all this stuff. Okay. Then he says about Julie Nagel. Julie Nagel, remember, let's not forget about Julie Nagel. She testified that around 1:43 in the morning, as she was passing by 34 Fairview, when she was leaving, she noticed a black object in the lawn. Now, Karen Reed, that morning, when she wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30, whatever it was, and she calls Jennifer McCabe. And she tells Jennifer McCabe, this is what she tells her, the first thing, we got into a fight and I left him at the waterfall, which again, that's also a lie that she left him at the waterfall. She didn't leave him at the waterfall. They went to 34 Fairview. But she does say that they got into a fight. What does she tell Kerry Roberts? Her story changes. Well, she thinks that a plow hit him. Now, something interesting that Lally points out, the fact that Karen Reed never called 911. If you're so hysterical, if you didn't just murder him and know what happened, if you're really hysterical and you're really concerning and care about your John O'Keefe, your boyfriend, why wouldn't you call the cops? Call 911. Why does other people have to do it? Karen never called 911. Now, of course, the argument against that would be that she didn't call 911 is because she was hysterical. When you're hysterical, you don't always think clearly. You don't always think what you should be doing rationally. You're just hysterical and you're running around. So that could be a reason why Karen Reed would not immediately think to call the cops. Also, people don't always want to think the worst. They want to say, okay, hopefully I'll just look around and I'll find him without having to get the cops involved. So, I mean, there are some, I think, reasonable explanations to this, but still a point that Lally made. Also, why is it? And this was a very important part. The fact that these surveillance cameras at around 5 o'clock in the morning, at 5:18, it picks up Karen Reed driving past a certain establishment. At 5:18 in the morning. Now, she doesn't arrive to Jennifer McCabe's house till 5:35. And it only takes about 2 minutes to get from where she was spotted on a surveillance camera at 5:18. It only takes about 2 minutes to get to Jennifer McCabe's house. So where did she go in between? Well, Lally suggests that she must have went to Fairview. She must have went to 34 Fairview to see if John O'Keefe is still there after she hit him. And then when she saw that, then she goes back to Jennifer McCabe pretending that she has no idea, and that claiming we have to go to Fairview to see where he is. And that's why when they get to Fairview, the only person in the car who's sitting in the back seat, by the way, I don't think he mentioned this, but he should have. Karen Reed was sitting in the back seat. She's the only one who sees John O'Keefe's body. And Jennifer McCabe and Carrie Roberts think she's crazy because they don't see anybody there. And Karen Reed runs out of the car, runs to the area exactly where John O'Keefe's body is. How did she know that? Now, another point that Lally made was the fact that for some reason, Karen Reed felt that she had to leave after the whole morning's events played out. She felt that she has to leave John O'Keefe's house. She went there, grabbed some belongings, and went to her parents' house. She drove all the way to her parents' house. Why would she do that? Why not just hang around John O'Keefe's house? You're familiar with it. You're used to it. Why do you have to run to your parents? What are you trying to run away from? Well, I think that the response to that would be, well, if John O'Keefe's dead or dying, she probably doesn't want to hang around his house by herself with the kids, with his kids, his niece and nephew. She probably wants to be around the support system like her parents. So it's not a crazy idea that you would want to go to her parents. I think it's very reasonable, but that was a point that he made. Also interesting that the first time she's speaking to Aaron O'Keefe after the morning's events, she says that I only remember the bad things, which is very, very odd. Why would Karen Reed say, after your boyfriend is dying or dead, that you only remember the bad things? Isn't that a time when you should remember the good times? Feel bad? Why would you only remember the bad things? And then why did she tell Aaron O'Keefe, I don't think I'll ever see you again? Isn't that an interesting statement to make to Aaron O'Keefe, they were good friends? Why would you say you're not going to ever see each other again or talk? That's strange. The only way that makes sense is if you think you're going to be charged with murder and thrown away. And then he talks about the Aruba trip. He talks about how Karen Reed got into this crazy idea that John O'Keefe was cheating somewhat with Marietta Sullivan, who really, he's the godfather of Laura Sullivan's son, and he's like an older brother in their family, and obviously there was nothing there going on. Just, again, playing it out. And he also talks about the kids, how the kids, the niece and nephew, were saying how the arguing between John O'Keefe and Karen Reed was really escalating and was really getting terrible. And John O'Keefe tried to separate himself, and Karen Reed would just come after him with arguments and really make his life very miserable, certainly near the end of their relationship. All about the ring videos. What about the ring videos that were on John O'Keefe's house, and they're missing? There were some videos that we kept hearing about during trial that were missing from that ring video. And those videos missing would have had, the videos missing were the ones of Karen Reed coming home after dropping off John O'Keefe at 34 Fairview and showing Jennifer McCabe and Carrie Roberts the taillight. Both of those videos are missing. Isn't that very interesting? Now, there's really been no evidence that Karen Reed had access to John O'Keefe's ring video footage, but nevertheless, that is what he brought out. Carrie Roberts said, and remember, this is before anybody from the police station got involved. Carrie Roberts said when she saw the broken taillight at Jennifer McCabe's house, it was consistent. It was the same exact way that it was broken from the pictures that she saw when that vehicle was at the Canton Police Department in the Sallyport. So this is Kerry Roberts seeing the car before any police got involved, before Michael Proctor allegedly went and started breaking the taillight himself and planting the pieces. This is before all that. Kerry Roberts saw that light at Jennifer McCabe's house, and then she saw pictures of it later at the Sallyport and said it's the same exact damage. Well, if it's the same exact damage, then no police did anything funny in this case. Now, remember when Lally brought out certain text messages between Laura Sullivan and Karen Reed that morning, the morning after. And Laura Sullivan was beside herself. She was so sad. She said, my heart's breaking for you, and my heart's breaking for the whole family, and I'm just beside myself. And Karen Reed was responding. And I was, at the time I was watching this, and I was wondering, why is Lally even bringing out these text messages? Like, what's the point? And at first I thought that, well, maybe it's because he wanted to show how cold Karen Reed was being about the fact that her boyfriend or long-term boyfriend just dropped dead, according to her, or was beaten up or something, was murdered or killed or whatever. And she just seems to be being very cold. That's what I thought that he was going to point out with those text messages. But in fact, he argued something else. And this is what he argued. He argued if you look at those text messages between Laura Sullivan and Karen Reed says to Laura Sullivan, when she's explaining what happened, John's dead, and we found him on the front lawn of 34 Fairview at 5 a.m. 5 a.m. Isn't that an interesting time? Why would she say 5 a.m.? We know that she didn't get there till like 6 a.m. or sometime after 6. That's when she located his body there. Why would she say 5 a.m.? Well, Lally argues because it was a slip. Because she went to that property. Remember between that timestamp between 5:18 and 5:35, that gap of time where we don't know where Karen Reed went? Because it's not possible she was on her way to Jennifer McCabe's house. Where did she go that time? Well, she must have went to 34 Fairview. So she slipped, and she told Laura Sullivan, we found him there at 5 a.m. because I did find him there at 5 a.m. But I forgot my story. Well, he also talked about the Google search, and of course, according to Lally, that Google search was done at 6:23. That's what the two experts testified to, Jessica Hyde and Ian Whiffen. And it was not done at 2:27. That was their testimony. That was what Lally said their testimony was. Then you also had the fact that Kerry Roberts and Jennifer McCabe really aren't friends. So to start to paint Kerry Roberts as part of this whole conspiracy, that doesn't make so much sense because they're not even such good friends. Also, he made a point, which was, I think, I don't know, a little stretch in my mind, but he made a point of why is it that Karen Reed, the testimony was that when they got to John O'Keefe's house, Karen Reed did not remove her shoes. She didn't remove her shoes when she went into John O'Keefe's house. And everybody knows that John O'Keefe was a very particular, very neat person. And he, in his house, the rule was you take your shoes off. And Kerry Roberts and Jennifer McCabe did take their shoes off when they first went to John O'Keefe's house to look for him. Right? They went together to look for him. That was their first stop. But Karen Reed didn't take her shoes off. Why didn't she take her shoes off? She knows the rule. Well, the reason why she didn't take her shoes off, Lally argued, was because she knows that she killed him. And if he's dead, obviously his rules don't matter anymore. Now, I think that's a little bit of a stretch because, again, we know that Karen Reed was hysterical. Right? How many people have testified to that? And when you're hysterical, you may not think, you know what, I should probably take my shoes off now. You're hysterical. You're running around like you're crazy. So you're not going to start following rules about taking your shoes off. So, but that's the argument that he made. And then he spoke about his theory about the magic hair. And he's like, oh, this magic hair that Ellen Jackson's talking about. Well, here's a very simple explanation how that hair stayed there. The hair was frozen onto the back of the vehicle. So when it's frozen on, it's not just going to lift off with some wind. It's frozen on there. So let's take that argument to its logical conclusion. Okay, if you're on the jury, this is what you're supposed to do, right? Okay, let's try to take that argument to its logical conclusion. That means that the hair was really there on Karen Reed's vehicle at, let's say, 12:30 in the morning. 12:30 in the morning when she smashed into John O'Keefe, his piece of his hair got stuck on the vehicle, and now what does she do? She leaves the scene. So how long does it take for a hair to get frozen onto a vehicle? It may take a little bit of time of it just sitting there, right? If you drive off the next second, is it going to still stay there? And so she drives the 6-minute drive home to John O'Keefe's house. Then in the morning, she takes off again, goes to Jennifer McCabe's house. She's rolling around there. And then eventually they tow the car also. And then also, let's take it one more step. In the Sally port, everything melts. It's a heated Sally port. Everything melts. So everything that was frozen onto the vehicle should have what? Melted, right? So that's what all these jumps that you have to do. You have to make in your mind that if we buy Lally's story, that here was there at 12:30, the next second when she takes off, that here stays somehow frozen onto the vehicle. That 1 second that it got onto the vehicle, it just froze immediately. This next second when she's driving off, I mean, there's a lot of jumps that you have to make to buy that. Now, he also attacks the conspiracy a little bit, and he attacks it in the following way. He says, let's think about this. Brian Albert and Brian Higgins just got back from a funeral from a fallen police officer who they don't even know. They just traveled all the way to New York to go to this funeral for this police officer they never even met. And then, do you think it makes any sense for them to come back and murder a police officer they do know? And then leave him on his front lawn? Do you think that makes any sense for Brian Albert, who is a police officer who investigates homicides, you would think? That he would think that it's a smart idea to kill someone and then leave that person, to leave the body on your front lawn? It's crazy. That doesn't make any sense for a conspiracy. Now, he didn't say one more argument which against the conspiracy, which I think he could have, which I think is a pretty strong argument. Also, it means, if you're going to buy this conspiracy, this is just me talking, which I think he could have argued, that means that every single person in that house had to come here and lie under oath. Every single person. And they all had to get their story straight. I mean, it's just fantastic for a group of people that large to try to come up with a conspiracy. And all the people that really weren't so close, like the Nagels, they also have to come up with a story. And nobody saw the body, and nobody saw anybody come into the house. All the people that were in that house that day, nobody saw anybody come in. So that's another part of this conspiracy, that every single person lied, and they somehow got their story straight. I mean, that's what you have to buy. And then he said, everybody testified that John O'Keefe never went into that house. And his theory, Lally's theory, is that Ryan Nagel, who didn't see John O'Keefe when he was passing by Karen Reed's SUV, he saw the dome light on. Now, when does the dome light go on? Well, you could turn it on yourself, but also it goes on when you open the door. So Lally's theory here is that when Ryan Nagel was passing by Karen Reed's car and he saw Karen Reed in the car with the dome light on, at that exact moment was when John O'Keefe opened the door and was exiting the vehicle and was about to close the door, I guess. And right before he closed the door, that's when the dome light was still on, and he only saw Karen Reed and not John O'Keefe. And then the next second, I guess when he closed the door, that's when the dome light went off. And then John O'Keefe went behind the car, Karen Reed, and then backed up the car into him. Now, Lally had a big problem in this case, and that was, what's he going to argue against the biomechanical engineers? Because really, in my mind, it comes down to the biomechanical engineers, who are extremely, extremely qualified experts. And they've said that it's just completely inconsistent with John O'Keefe, being hit by the car damage and the injuries to John O'Keefe. So Lally comes up with a suggestion, which I guess is better than nothing, maybe. And his suggestion was that one of the data points, again, this is only one of them, but one of the data points was the fact that the damage to the vehicle was only 6 inches long. And the injuries to John O'Keefe's arm, if you look at the arm, it's about 12 inches. So how would 12 inches of injury equal 6 inches of damage to a car? That doesn't make sense. So Lally came up with an idea. He said, well, if you bend your arm like this, it's not out like this, if you bend it like this, then it could equal 6 inches. And that's how this happened. Now, that was his suggestion. And to think, and again, if you're on the jury, you got to be thinking like this, to think that these biomechanical engineers who are trying to figure out every possible explanation to this, do you think that they didn't have this idea? You think that they overlooked that possibility? That maybe he stuck out his arm like this? And that's how he got hit? Their job is to figure out any sort of way, any possibility how this accident happened. That's why they had to reconstruct or create a cannon to go and shoot the drinking glass. So to think that they didn't have that possibility in their mind is a stretch. So that was essentially Lally's closing arguments. Now, just one other thing, right, is that for Alan Jackson, right, like I said in the beginning, when you're starting off your closing arguments and you're going first, you've got to anticipate what the other side is going to argue. And for Alan Jackson not to anticipate that Adam Lally is going to make some sort of very big deal with Karen Read saying, I hit him, is just beyond me. How can you just think for him? Of course, if you're the prosecutor, you're going to argue that. And therefore, if you're Alan Jackson in your closing arguments, you have to address that. How could he not address that? That was one thing that really, really stuck out. And there's at least two explanations in my mind how to explain away that it's really not a confession, it's really not an admission. Number one, the first way is, Karen Read is completely hysterical that morning. She doesn't know what happened. She's screaming to Jennifer McCabe. She's screaming to Carrie Roberts. She's beside herself. She's screaming, oh, maybe I hit him. Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? And at some point, she decides that must have been what happened, that she actually hit him. Now, she was drunk. I think that's pretty clear from the evidence. She was drunk, and she doesn't remember. And therefore, she's, in her mind, deciding, I must have hit him, after she's completely hysterical. And therefore, that's why she blurts out, I hit him, because she convinces herself that that's what happened in this case. And that's why she's saying that. I hit him, because she just convinced herself. But it's not actually what happened. That's number one. Number two explanation that Alan Jackson could have done with this I hit him argument is, even if a person thinks that they hit someone, even if Karen Read thinks mistakenly that she must have hit him, if the science and physics and mathematics don't equal her hitting him with the car, then guess what? She's mistaken. She's just mistaken. She may think all day long that she hit him, but if the science doesn't say that, doesn't support that conclusion, then guess what? She didn't hit him, and she's mistaken. So those are two explanations that Alan Jackson could have used to explain away why Karen Read's I hit him is not in confession. And again, he didn't do that, which I think was a little mistake. Also, he didn't stress the fact that these steps that are taken, it's not just the fact that the Waze uses a different clock than some of the other apps in the phone, and therefore the steps maybe were when they were still in the car. Ladies and gentlemen, let's first of all use our common sense. Do you think that an iPhone or any smartphone is going to have the capabilities and the technology to record steps, but it's going to be completely inaccurate because you're always in your car all day? Does that make any sense to have a pedometer on your phone when it's completely inaccurate? Does that make any sense? So of course, when they're going to design, use your common sense. When you're going to design this type of technology, they're going to account for a person being in the car. And if they're not able to figure out how it can count your steps when you're also driving in the car to not register those as steps, they're not going to have that function in the phone. That's number one. Number two is that their own expert, Richard Green, tested this. He actually tested, and this is what he testified to. He tested whether the phone will record any sort of step, and he mimicked him making a step without actually taking a step. And he went in his car, and he moved it all around, and he went up bumps and down bumps, and he tried to do whatever he could, and he was not able to get that phone to register a step unless he actually took a step. That's how good this technology is. So that is what the experts, that's what the data shows. This phone doesn't register steps, and there's been no evidence at all that it does. It's only a guess by Trooper Guriano, whatever his name is, forgot. He said that it must have been going up and down. That must have been what would cause steps to register. He didn't do any testing. There's no evidence that that's what happens. It's a guess. And we have evidence that it doesn't happen. So those steps must have been actually taken. And again, that was something that Alan Jackson did not talk about. All right, so overall, that was my analysis on the closing arguments. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see what the verdict comes back with. I imagine, like I've said in my other videos, I just believe that there's just too much reasonable doubt here to convict Karen Reed. That's just what my take is after seeing all the evidence. Those biomechanical engineers very, very clearly said it just doesn't fit with science, physics, and math that John O'Keefe got hit by a car. If he didn't get hit by a car, Karen Reed didn't murder him. So the case should be, she should be acquitted. Now, whether it's going to be acquitted or whether a hung jury, that's what I imagine that's what I would guess the verdict is going to be. I would certainly be surprised if the verdict comes back as guilty, but juries can do whatever they want. And yeah, I've seen very strange things that juries have done, which sometimes I believe goes completely against the evidence and completely what I believe. But, the juries can do whatever they want. We'll see what they do. Thank you all. If you haven't, let's subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.